So many of our kids don't even understand the basics of what is a healthy relationship. What are my boundaries?
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Is it possible to foster in children the skills and knowledge needed to avoid trafficking and exploitation without needlessly exposing them, even in a small way, to the devastating ugliness of those worlds? My guest today, Erin Williamson, believes that it is possible. Erin is the Chief Programs and Strategy Officer at Love146, an organization that has been fighting to end child trafficking and exploitation for over 2 decades. As you will hear, the approach Love146 takes is evidence-based, trauma-informed, and developmentally appropriate. In short, it is everything we advocate for on Talking About Kids. Talking About Kids is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. If you think that others might benefit from the type of information presented here, well, then please like this episode and share the Talking About Kids podcast with your friends and colleagues. And now, the interview.
Like a lot of people who do this work, I initially started doing international work, right? Thinking that this was an issue that only affected children kind of over there, wherever there is in other countries, and was not prevalent here in the United States. And as I delved deeper into my work, I got a job actually. So I initially was I did this work over abroad when I was doing my semester abroad in Kenya. And then I went after I graduated college to Mexico and did this work again. And then I came back stateside to get my master's, again, focusing on international work. And started delving into the concept of child sex tourism, which was deeply disturbing, kind of the idea that people take trips with the intentionality of engaging in sexual relationships with children overseas. And then I really became aware that this was also happening here in the United States, right? So I took a job with an organization called Polaris, which runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And that was really what brought me stateside to realizing what was happening to our own children and children being brought into our country.
And right now, you are the Chief Programs and Strategy Officer at Love146.
Yes.
And you tell me a little bit about the mission. And do you say, when you're around Love146, do you say Love146? Do you say, what's the nomenclature at the offices?
Yes. So the nomenclature is Love146. And, our mission really is the end of child trafficking. And we say then nothing less, because really that is the goal, to eradicate it, both through prevention and then also healing and justice. And those are kind of we span that spectrum, everything from preventing it from happening at first, all the way through working with children who have experienced this form of victimization and then preventing the reoccurrence.
Something that I started to share a little bit with you as we were setting up this interview is that, I have some real biases around talking about this topic. And I'm going to explain those in just a moment. But I just want to let my listeners know that before I reached out to Erin, I did my homework, as you expect me to do, on Love146. And, I talked to the sources, many of whom have been on Talking About Kids before. and said, what do you think? And the reason that I had to do that, Erin, is because too often I have found people in this space that do this thing that I'm really a little uncomfortable with, where it's almost sickening to explain, but it seems like, well, first of all, they obfuscate numbers. They change topics around. They use one set of numbers to describe a larger problem, but then they talk about this very specific part of the problem. And the other thing that I don't like is their stories and their language seem so exploitive and almost verging on tittillating. It's weird, and I don't like it. So one of the things that I was really excited to talk to you about is, Love146 is very open about what makes for a good intervention in this space. And so I want to talk about, first of all, those things that you recommend looking out for when you are looking to engage with an organization around child trafficking and child sexploitation. But I also want to define some terms before we go any further. So first of all, the 4 terms that get thrown around a lot are human trafficking, child trafficking, exploitation, and sexual exploitation. So can you help me define those 4 terms?
Sure. Yeah. And you're right. A lot of these terms are used interchangeably. And in fact, we're currently doing a rigorous randomized control evaluation of our prevention program. And we even put these terms to the kids that we plan to interview. And they had, we threw in even more terms, and they had very different opinions than the adults did about what various terms mean. So trafficking is the one that is defined in most law and kind of, and trafficking is a pretty broad term, right? So trafficking involves adults and children, people of all genders. It involves labor trafficking and sex trafficking. A couple of years ago, the IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration, redefined their definition to include child marriage. It is a very broad term. So you're right. There are a lot of big numbers associated with that concept. Then when you kind of pull into the United States, which is kind of our focus here, then we're dealing with, that you need the terms force, fraud, or coercion when you're dealing with adults. And when you're dealing with children, and you're dealing with sex trafficking, it's really any form of sexual acts in exchange for anything of value. So, it gets even more confusing when you differentiate between federal laws and state laws. For example, one of the places we primarily work with survivors is in Connecticut. At the federal level, you can be considered a victim of human trafficking if you exchange sex and receive something directly, right? Receive a ride, receive drugs, receive place to stay, shelter. In the state of Connecticut, you would be considered a victim of child sexual exploitation. Yeah. So again, some of this is the legal jargon, but basically what we generally say is there's no such thing as a child prostitute. And if you can keep that concept in your mind, then you kind of have a general understanding of who we're talking about.
Yeah, and again, I just want to clarify, my problem with how these terms get used interchangeably is not that I'm callous to its impact on children. It's that I want to see the right focus. And I don't like that shell game, because that happens where they say, this number of people have been trafficked. And then the example they provide is sexual exploitation of children. Because it conflates the problem in a way that I think doesn't help either issue. They're separate issues. Love146 has a couple programs. You mentioned the program that is being evaluated by our friends over at the University of New Hampshire at the Crimes Against Children Research Center. We've had Tanya Whitworth on Talking About Kids before, or Corinne Jenkins Tucker. You can go back and listen to that. And for a different project, I've actually interviewed David Finkelhor. So this is a team of people that I absolutely respect, and they've done such great work in helping children over many, many years. David's work is groundbreaking. But tell me a little bit about your Not a Number program.
Yeah, so our Not a Number program is really aimed at the middle school and early high school age youth. And the goal is to really go back to like, what is a healthy relationship, right? And so many of our kids don't even understand the basics of what is a healthy relationship. What are my boundaries? I'm allowed to have boundaries. How do my boundaries change depending on how the person is in my life? My boundaries might be different with my family versus my friends versus teachers, a coach, romantic partner. And then when somebody starts to cross those boundaries, how can I respond? And so one of the things in working with the University of New Hampshire that's been really helpful, and we've been working with them for over 10 years, was they really pushed us to focus on skill building. A lot of curriculums, focus on, and our initial take at it was to focus on information, right? But kids know drugs are bad and kids still do drugs, right? So they really pushed us. It's not about information deficit. It's about what do those kids then do when they are in difficult situations and have to make difficult decisions.
And do you find, I know that there's a fair amount of research about this, that there is coercive sexual acts among young people that participate in them. There is the overwhelming belief that that is the norm. So what are you doing to help, especially those kids, recognize that coercion isn't part of sexuality?
Yeah, and you're right, and a lot of the messages, right, that our youth receive through various social media, through other forms of entertainment and media, are not clear about boundaries, don't emphasize boundaries, and really do, overly emphasize kind of the pleasures or whatever that can come along, and the expectations, I think, really related to sexual engagement. And in fact, when you look at studies, it actually shows that fewer and fewer kids are having sex at a very younger age, and that age at first intercourse is getting older and older with each generation. And so it's not really reflecting the reality of what we're seeing on the ground. But you're right. And a lot of that curriculum is helping youth to see that, right? Helping youth to understand, what is the goal of an advertiser who, promotes that they're selling a product and yet the product doesn't even appear in the advertisement, right? And really what is that advertisement trying to sell you? And what are the implicit messages? And are you going to become conscious of it? And I think that, that is one of the really important things that we can do is start to have some of those conversations in an age appropriate manner,
right,
at even younger ages. One of the things that we are really cognizant about is that while every kid has vulnerabilities, some kids have more vulnerabilities than other, and traffickers do target kids who have more vulnerabilities. Certainly we have seen kids that you would not expect, who come from homes, two-parent homes with, socioeconomic stability and things like that. But a lot of times traffickers are trafficking and going after and pursuing children that they think are kind of lower hanging fruit, for lack of a better word, right? Who have shared that maybe their system involved, or maybe their family is struggling with food or housing insecurity, or they're looking for love and they don't feel like anybody loves them. And so, I think, again, talking to them about what are your needs in your life and how do you get those needs made, fulfilled. And some of them are basic needs and food, but I would argue love is also a basic need, especially for a child. And when they don't feel like they're getting that in their life, they are going to seek out that basic need in the same way they would seek out food or shelter or some other form of basic need.
And it is one of the things that I like, I mentioned that, Love146, on its website, in its material, they say, if you can't work with us when you're looking for a program in your community, make sure that they are research-based, evidence-informed, and that they are trauma informed. Because what you're talking about when you're talking about those stable relationships, you're talking about resilience, right? So that is that building block. That is what's going to help these kids recognize when a relationship is exploiting as opposed to, strengthening and building up those skills. And again, longtime listeners know that we talk about trauma-informed practices a lot on this, and there's multiple episodes they can go back and listen to. How does, there's two things that I want to talk about, because what you're doing is delicate in today's, I would say, activist school board environment, especially. And because part of what you're talking about are social and emotional skills, of course. And part of what you're talking about is sex education. And we have seen a backlash across this country where there is this false narrative, has no evidence to back it up, that one, social and emotional learning is actually religious indoctrination. That's this crazy thing that we see in some communities. But also this idea that when you teach sex education, you encourage kids to have sex. Now, both you and I know that's wrong, but both you and I know that we have this mountain of research that shows quite the opposite. Quite the opposite, that when you teach kids, they have more healthy sexual relationships. And to your point, they engage in first sexual intercourse later and later in life. So how does Love146 counter that narrative when you're trying to get a school to join and to use your Not a Number program? What do you do? How do you arm them? And I'm asking this very specifically, Erin, because I think I probably have listeners and I have parents and I have direct service providers that say, I would like a program like this in my community. How do I, get over these other very loud voices?
Yeah, no, and you're right. The research is one thing, and then people's perceptions, is not always aligned. And really, our emphasis is, kids need to understand what a healthy relationship is, and really, that is not something that we teach, unfortunately, in schools. And so, oftentimes, by the time they're hitting this really pivotal moment in their life where they're trying to figure out, who am I as a person? How do I fit into the world? Who do I want as, my friends, as my, when I have young kids, right? When they're little and they're still in the early elementary days, the friendship groups kind of meld. They play with everyone. Everyone's invited and they very much flow. And then you hit this middle school age, and groups start to coalesce and kids start to wonder where they fit, right? And then you hit these early, late middle school, early high school age, and you start getting this very age-appropriate rebellion against parents as kids start to assert their independence. And what we say is, in those years where kids are trying to figure out who they are and trying to assert their independence, we want to create kids that really understand fundamentally who they are, right? What are their boundaries? What do they want in a relationship? And that they understand that they deserve healthy relationships, right? Unfortunately, not every kid has had healthy relationships modeled in their homes, right? Or in their families. And so we really start at a baseline of, what is a relationship? A very little of our curriculum is talking about kind of anything of sexual nature. It's really about, healthy relationships and what are warning signs and warning flags and how do you get out of those situations. And it's not just around kind of sex ed. We've met with so many kids and they'll say, well, I kind of learned all drugs were bad. So, sometimes I do heroin and sometimes I do marijuana. And it's like, okay, we need to start with kind of some basics. First of all, let's start, I don't want you to do drugs, but you also do need to understand kind of differences because, the risks factors, both for your health, for addiction, for all of it, just are vastly different. And we take a very non-judgmental approach, right? In both our survivor care and our prevention education curriculum. Kids come to us wherever they're at. Most of our kids are not experimenting with heroin. Some of them are, right? We're going to approach them wherever they're at. And how we say it is, look, we just work with kids who find themselves in really difficult situations and have to make really difficult decisions. And we want to give you information so that you can make the best decision for yourself if you ever find yourself in a difficult situation. And that non-judgmental framing really does open up the door, both in prevention and in survivor care, for kids to know, okay, this is someone I can go to and they're not going to judge me, right? And sometimes they test us, right? Sometimes they'll give us a little inkling of what's happening in their life and they wait to see our reaction, right? Are we really non-judgmental?
Right.
Are we going to have an exaggerated reaction?
Right.
And based on how we react in that moment, then they will decide whether or not they're going to disclose more of what is happening in their life.
Or sometimes, Erin, they do the opposite and they put that fire hose of bad things on you to see if they're going to rattle you or shake you, or if you're going to go running because other people have, right? It's so tricky. You bring up your survivor care initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about those, please?
Sure. So our program, we say we work with kids at high risk, suspected, confirmed. We do not require any disclosure to be part of our program. And we think that that's a really critical aspect of our program because youth aren't compelled to disclose any information they don't want to disclose to us. And first we go out, we provide what's called a rapid response. We bring a backpack full of stuff that youth and other providers have identified as being kind of important for this population. It's everything from chapstick and toiletries to journals, to art supplies and stress balls, and also some information packets. And we go out, and it's an hour to an hour and a half, and we say, we're just here to provide information. We're not saying anything we discussed today will or has or will happen to you. We just, again, want to make sure that you have the information you need to make the best decisions to keep yourself safe. And then at the end of that rapid response, we will go on to describe our long-term services. And, we say, look, we come out, we spend a couple hours with you every week. If you have meetings at your school, we'll go with you. If you have, larger case management meetings, especially for those who are involved in the child welfare system, we can go to those. If you have to go to law enforcement or to, talk to anybody, we can accompany with you. For all those, we also have the motto, we go where you go. So instead of asking youth to come to us at a drop-in center or to our, organization and building, all of our social workers have cars and they drive around the state. Connecticut's a small state, so I acknowledge that. But if our youth, have a placement disruption, if they're in child welfare or are hospitalized because they have suicidal ideation for a period of time, or their family just moves across the state, that same social worker follows them and works with them and their family, providing a continuity of services that they don't often receive. Our care plans are youth developed, so they identify goals they want to work on, and we have measurable objectives. And we're an incentive-based program, so as they achieve each objective, we celebrate like you would with your own kid, right? And we work with them pretty intensely for about 6 to 9 months. And then we start kind of slowly stepping back as we see them having progress to every other week. And we find that kind of slow step back really helps with them maintaining that progress. And again, to your point, not all of a sudden having an emergency to say, see, I still need you, come back into my life. Right. And we also have the motto that we never close a case. So youth know, even when we stop kind of regularly engaging with them, they're always able to reach back out to give us updates or to ask for support and services. And over 50% of our youth do take advantage of that.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you bring up this interesting point, too, that, the little bit that I know about exploitation, it really does a number on what they believe they need to do to get their needs met. And, if this is the relationship that you've been in for any period of time, you start to believe that you yourself need to manipulate in order to get the things that you need. So just helping them get past that is huge, is absolutely. You mentioned being non-judgmental, and Love146 has on its website the 20 tips for caregivers. That's a big one. That's one of the 20, right? That you look at your language and be non-judgmental. I know that's hard. The example that I believe that Love146 provides is to talk about a decision as being stupid. The decision, of course, might have been unwise, but we want to make sure that the kid who's hearing it doesn't think that we are calling them stupid for all the reasons that you already mentioned. But what are some of those other tips? So if I am, a teacher or even a parent, or a parent that's exposed to some of my children's friends, or I'm working in that after-school program, what are some of my some tips to begin to engage somebody that we suspect might be a victim?
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I did not say that when you go on our website, on the top of the first page, you can actually sign up for emails specifically for parents, but it's also for any kind of caregiver or parent that talks kind of about how to introduce technology, right? That's one of the biggest questions that we get from parents and caregivers is, what do I do about technology? I can't keep up. I don't know. And we really emphasize that, when you think about these things, when you think about talking to your kids about technology, about any of this, think about it as like teaching them how to cross a street, right? You're not going to necessarily, or most people would not, take a 6-year-old and bring them to, downtown New York and let their hand go and say, I'll be back in an hour. Good luck, right? First, you're going to hold their hands. You're going to teach them how to look both ways. Eventually, you will drop holding their hands, but you're still going to walk next to them. You're going to make sure they know kind of how to deal with busier intersections. But the goal is that by 18, right, your kid could theoretically go to New York City and navigate and not get run over by a car. But the reality is, cars exist on the street, right? And there is danger in crossing a street no matter what. And even if you are, you know how to cross a street, you do everything right, you could potentially get hit by a car. And that's what's so scary for parents, right? And I think that one of the things that we really emphasize, and I say this as a parent myself, right? I have a 9 and a 13-year-old, is, you have to live with the anxiety and the tension that you can't keep your kid 100% safe, right? That you can do everything right and the worst thing can still happen. And that's such a hard thing to live with as a parent, but it's so important for us to teach our kids that by large scopes, the world is a safe place, right? Generally speaking, kids need to be encouraged to go out, to explore, and they need to know that you're that safe base that they can come home to. God forbid the worst thing happens, right? And that you will be a consistent in their life and you will be there for them. And I think one of the most important things, like, for example, we taught our kids growing up, right, is from early on, we taught them our family doesn't have secrets. And if anybody ever asks you, can you, keep a secret? You say, my family doesn't have secrets. And if you think about it, perpetrators, people that want to do, harm your kids, that's one of the first things they're going to ask kids. They're going to test, can you keep a secret? And if the response they get from a child is, my family doesn't have secrets, they're not going to go after that child, right? Because the chances that they'll be discovered, the chances that that kid discloses are so much higher. And so I think one of the things when we talk about parents, when we talk about caregivers, kind of reaching out and starting these conversations, it's really saying, this isn't about me not trusting you. This isn't about me thinking the world is so unsafe. This is about me balancing those two things, right? I trust you. I know you're a good person. I also know that you're developmentally going to be pushing boundaries, right? One of the things you can do if if you have a preteen in the house, normalizing. Look, I have rules. And part of your job right now at this age is to push against those rules. And you might even break some of those rules. But the most important thing, and the thing I want you to really understand is that when that happens, the most important thing for me is your safety, right? It's not that you broke a rule. It's not that you did something you knew you weren't supposed to do. It's your safety. And sure, we'll deal with all the other stuff together, but I want you to know that your safety is number one. Because a lot of times kids will say, well, I knew they would get mad at me because I wasn't supposed to go to that party, or I wasn't supposed to leave the house, or I was grounded. And so therefore I didn't say what had happened to me, right? It was the fact that they broke the rule that kept them from disclosing to the people who ultimately would want them to disclose to them.
And again, in not knowing what those consequences are going to be.
Absolutely.
Right? Which is surprising. Haven't you broken a rule before? How do you not know what's going to happen there? And again, it's, I think listeners are going to recognize that what Erin's talking about and Love146 is talking about, other guests have talked about too, that's this communication. That's talking and being aware. You talk about also don't mechanize oversight of these online spaces. Don't think that because you turned on a parental control that they're safe. This is about exploring with your kids. It's about talking about, it's about actually seeing these programs and devices and websites that they want to use. And as you point out in your materials, have them explain them to you. Have them be the expert and show you why it's okay that they're on this site. And again, listeners will recognize that Michael Rich talks about this too in his developmentally appropriate internet safety initiative. I think that the last thing I want to kind of get your input on, Erin, is one of the things that I worry about is how to get programs kind of embedded in communities so that they're not just a standalone initiative. Like, oh, okay, so now we're going to do Not a Number right now. And that's going to last for 20 minutes today. And so what's your advice to teachers, again, and parents and other direct service providers to make this a part of the routine and not just something that they do a couple times a week if they're lucky?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. And in some ways, if I knew the answer, I would have a magic wand and wave it. I think that we're in this cyclical change where, right, people are realizing, oh, we have to do internet safety. We have to do all of these things. There's a lot mandated of schools in particular that a lot legislatively mandated that they have to do. Certainly, I do think that, mandating thing in legislation there's a benefit to it. Mm-hmm. But I also think that we need to think, what do we need to teach kids and at what ages is it the most appropriate, right? So, I've seen speaking of University of New Hampshire, I was just with Lisa Jones, who is kind of one of the people that works there, and she's the PI for our research study, the principal investigator. And she showed this amazing slide in a presentation the other day, really showing which age group, elementary, middle, or high school, should get which type of prevention education. Yeah. And it was such a wonderful slide because I think we say like social emotional, they should get it K through 12, right? Anti-trafficking, everything is K through 12. Well, and actually there really are clear building blocks, right? Mm-hmm. Of things that can build on each other. And so, I would encourage you to think about, what actually, most things are not needed K through 12. I would argue anti-trafficking programs, middle school is the perfect point. You mm-hmm. want to get them before they hit high school, but you also don't want to be introducing concepts to them at too young of an early age. Social emotional, that's a basic building block. That should be in elementary school, early elementary school. So we need to think about what we teach when, and I think if we could do that and give a little grace to our teachers and our educators and not expect them to be all things everywhere, but kind of create that prevention timeline and compendium of programs, then I actually think it would be more integrated into the school system because they would see it as building blocks off of each other.
Well, and I think it's also getting the teachers educated too, because I think that, they're sometimes the last, or they sometimes get the least amount of training on these things. They're told, here's the new curriculum, here's the worksheet, here's the, this is what you're going to do today. And if they don't see it as part of the larger school climate program, if they don't know how the human trafficking module, if you will, fits in with the larger social emotional, fits in with behavior management, fits in with bullying prevention, because they're all the same thing, Erin.
Right.
They really are all the same thing. If they don't understand that, then they're not going to kind of embody and integrate all of those lessons in their day-to-day speech, in how they talk about assignments, which is ideally what we're looking for.
Absolutely. And oftentimes you will have a singular teacher that's you're responsible for this curriculum.
Right.
You're responsible. And again, I think it's hard. I think the professional development time, I sit on my kid's school board. I understand even as a school board member, right? That time is limited and there's a lot asked of them. And we're always learning, what's the latest and greatest, even in teaching reading and math and kind of those basics. And so we know it's a lot to ask of teachers. We know it's a lot to ask of, anyone really who has a job where part of their job is just caring for our young kids. And so, I thank you. I thank you for everything you're doing. Hopefully Love146's website can be a resource for you. And even when you share tips and little tidbits with, other educators and with your friends, that's how we spread the word. And that's also how we normalize these conversations so that more adults are comfortable having these conversations and therefore more kids will disclose if anything is happening in their lives.
And links to all of these tips and tricks are going to be on the website for this episode. And Erin, thank you so much for putting up with me and taking the time to come on and share this information. And thank you for all the work that you're doing at Love146.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Erin Williamson. More information about Erin and Love146 is at talkingaboutkids.com. And when you do visit talkingaboutkids.com, leave me a note. I would love to hear from you. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.